fellow knitters, Clubkidknitter here. I was going through my videos and realized that I have not made a video on how to join two ends of yarn. In other words, when you come to the end of your current working yarn and you need to attach either the same color or a new color. In this video, I'm going to show you 4 different ways to do this, and 2 involve a knot and the other 2 don't. What I'll also do is talk about the pros and cons for each of the joins I'll demonstrate. For the first join, and here's my new yarn, we'll be doing what's referred to as a spit join. In essence, you will be felting the ends to one another using both moisture and friction. As a side note, this is why you never want to put a wool knit or garment in your tumble dryer. The combination of moisture, heat, and friction will cause it to felt, and once wool is felted, there's no going back to what it was originally. We want to be able to join these two ends in a 3 to 4 inch segment to ensure a good and strong join. Each of these ends are a 2-ply fingering weight, as you can see when it is unraveled. You may be wondering, won't this change, albeit temporarily, the weight of the yarn for that segment, and will it not be obvious? The answer is yes, because in essence, you are going from a 2-ply to a 4-ply. I'm going to show you a neat trick, however, to avoid having a bulky and unsightly segment in your yarn at the transition point from one ball or skein to the other. Let's get started. At about 3 inches up for one of the 2 ends, I'm going to unravel these 2 plies and then pick them apart into their constituents. What I'm going to do next is fray the ends, as that will facilitate the felting process. I use my fiskars, but you may use a knife or something with a sharp edge. Do be careful not to cut yourself, or more specifically your thumb. Only apply enough pressure to hold the yarn onto the blade. Next, what I'm going to do with one of the 2 plies of the wool is, starting close to where the 2 plies twist together, again about 3 inches in from the end, start scraping and pulling at the wool. What you are doing is thinning out this piece of the end. As you can see, I repeat this process to literally fray the end. You will come to a point where all you have to do is simply pull away this portion of tail. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing on the very tip or end of the other ply, again fraying that end. What we are doing is staggering the ends. One is shorter than the other. Again, do be mindful of the sharp edge. Next, you are going to do the exact same thing with the end of the new ball you are getting ready to join. We have now prepared both ends. You want to place both ends opposing one another into the palm of your non-dominant hand. If you notice, I am aligning the staggered ends of each tail in such a way to ensure a consistent number of plies between both yarn ends. Now I have 2 plies here, 2 plies here, and 2 plies here. All are the same weight going through this segment join. Next, use either a little spit, or as I'm using, a 2-finger dab of water. I simply stroke it directly below where both tails lie in my hand. Next, you place your dominant hand on top and begin to rub both palms back and forth, and you want to do this until your palms become hot from the friction. Then you can come down here to smooth out this little piece and do the same on the other side. Now you can see these are felted together and joined, and they are not going to come apart. If you now notice, the weight from the new yarn transitioning from the old yarn is a consistent weight throughout. Okay, so what are the pros and cons? A pro is that you are not having to deal with a knot. I would always use this method if I've attached additional wool to a tail on a piece of knitting that I'm going to Kitchener or graft, because you are continuously drawing the wool through those live stitches. If there was a knot, this would be hard to do, as the knot would keep snagging. A con would be an inconsistent appearance of the wool within the join section. If you are using plied wool, you'd see the twists, and then what looks like a worsted section, and then back to seeing the twists. This is hardly noticeable, however, because that aspect would be well hidden within the actual stitches of your knit, regardless of the color of wool. The second technique I'm going to show you is a Russian join. Again, this is a knotless join. Now you will need a needle for this method, And make sure the eye or opening of the needle is large enough to allow for the specific weight of yarn you are using to fit. I also recommend using a dull or blunted tip so that you don't prick yourself when doing this method. This one happens to be a tapestry needle. What you are going to do is thread the end of the new yarn you will be joining. You will then take the tail of the old yarn to which you will be joining the new and lay it across or on top of the new yarn. Now what you are going to do is take the tip of the threaded needle and go in between the plies of that same yarn. In and out, or back and forth. And of course, this is easier to do with 2 or more plies. I'm attempting to go in between each of them, the snake who eats his own tail. You want to make sure that the end of the tail of the old yarn does not come out of the newly formed loop of the new yarn you are joining. Overall, what you are doing is interlocking the two together like this. Now I'm simply pulling what is now a new tail on the new yarn through itself. Right now, if you notice, there is a big loop here, almost mimicking the appearance of a needle with an eye. To close that loop, simply pull on the tail of the new yarn, like this. Pull on it until the end of the loop comes to kiss the tail of the old yarn that is basically threaded through the new yarn. And as you've probably guessed, we are now going to do the exact same thing with the tail of the old yarn. Take the tail of the old yarn and thread it through the eye of the tapestry needle. Again, I'm going in between each of the twists of the tail. I like to go through at least 6 or 7 of the twists, and also, don't worry about splitting the yarn. Again, you'll see a large loop that is interlocked with the other loop, and to close that, all you do is simply give a tug on the tail of the old yarn until that loop closes around the other. Now you have these two tails sticking out, and you're probably wondering, what am I going to do with these? All you have to do is snip this away from what is now your new working yarn. Of course, being careful to only snip away the tail and not the yarn itself or your fingers. And you'll do the same exact thing to the other side. Now these are joined and are not coming apart or undone. And once actually knitted within your work, the ends can't come apart or unjoined. Okay, so what are the pros and cons with this join? A pro is that it is a knotless join. A con would be having an inconsistent thickness going on within this 3-inch section. You've actually doubled the weight on either side of the interlocking loop as far up as you have interwoven each of the ends. Subsequently, you may notice that 2 or 3 of your stitches are thicker than that of all the rest. If you are doing color work or a textured knit, such as the moss stitch as I'm presently knitting, this should not be as noticeable. If, however, you are doing a stockinette stitch within a swath with only one color, you may notice those particular stitches. The third method I'm going to show you does actually involve using a knot and is referred to as a magic knot. What you're going to do is take your new yarn and place it under your old yarn, the one you're at the end of. You're going to take the yarn closest to you, again your new yarn, and place it underneath the old yarn. Then you're going to bring it over the old yarn and then under and through the loop. And then pull it tight. Next, take the old yarn tail that is furthest from you and bring it on top of the new yarn. You're going to bring it under both and then through the loop, aiming it away from you. And then you're going to pull the knot tight. I'm going to make sure the other one is tight too. Then what you're going to do, and this is why it's called the magic knot, this is pretty cool. You're going to just pull on both ends and bring the two knots up toward one another until they kiss. This is one of those knots that is self-tightening. In other words, the more tension that is placed upon them, the tighter they become. Many times with a regular knot, it can pull apart from pulling too tight. The physics behind the magic knot is quite the opposite. The harder you pull, the stronger the knot becomes. Now, what some people do, and I'll demonstrate this on just one of the two tails, is they come in with a pair of scissors, and you want to be careful not to snip on either side of the knot itself or your fingers, and snip away the tails. The premise of the magic knot is that you can do this and rest assured the knot won't come undone. Now, for me and my anxiety, I personally don't do this. I actually leave the tails attached to the knot. I always fear that over time or through wear and tear, it'll eventually come undone, but that's just me. What I do instead is after knitting several rows or rounds past where the join occurs, I pull the tails to the back or the wrong side of my work. I'll either leave them dangling, or if they want to be neat and tidy, I'll actually go and weave in each tail using the double purl method. You may also leave them in the front and weave them in using the double knit method. My personal preference is for all of that to be done on the wrong side. Regardless, you can rest assured that either side of the join won't ever slip past the knot. A pro for this method is that the consistency of the ply is maintained between the old yarn and the new one. Another pro is that this is a much stronger knotted join due to the self-tightening aspect. A con would be, it is a knot, so if you're attempting this particular join in doing Kitchener or grafting work, the knot will snag on the live stitches until reaching and passing the point of the join. The only other con is that if you plan on leaving the tails, you'd have a couple of more ends to weave in. The fourth and final join method I'm going to show you is probably the easiest one, and you're now asking why I didn't do this one first, and I don't know. This technique shows you what to do when you've come to the end of one yarn and need to join a new one. As a side note, this is actually the one you're probably already the most familiar with if you knit Fair Isle colorwork. In essence, you're simply going to introduce a new yarn, either the same color or a second color. Again, the latter, which is typically done for stranded colorwork. Now, interestingly enough, this method does technically use, at the very least, a half knot, because it is required to create a bar between the prior stitch with the old color and the new stitch with the new yarn. If you don't do this, you will in effect have a noticeable hole between those two stitches. The goal is to have a seamless join between those two stitches to give the illusion, especially with the same color, that a yarn change hasn't occurred. What I'm going to do is drop the tail of what's left of the old yarn behind my work. Now pick up the new yarn, and I'm giving myself about a 6-inch tail, and I simply loop it around the tip of the right needle that's already been inserted into the stitch, and pull the loop through to completion. Again, the tail of the new yarn stays behind or on the wrong side of your work. You're going to continue on knitting, being mindful to pick up the business end of your new yarn you've just introduced as opposed to the tail. I've knitted about half a dozen stitches, and now we're going to pause and take a look at what's going on the back or the wrong side of your work. Now, as can be seen, you have an open end here and an open end here. As both are open, there is a gap or hole in between the two stitches belonging to each of the tails. This is the point at which we want to tie the two tails together. Now, some people do a single tie or a half knot, and some people do a double tie or a full knot. I'll discuss the reasoning behind either one in the pros and cons toward the end of this demonstration. Do also be mindful of the tension, not too tight and not too loose. Try and match the tension of the other stitches that appear on the needle, and of course with these two ends, all you're going to do is weave them into your work. What are the pros and cons for this technique? It is probably the most common and most organic way of adding a new ball or skein of wool to your work. It is typically the method for all fair isle, stranded, and intarsia color work. Next, I want to talk specifically about the difference between using either a half knot or a full knot. The latter is a noticeable knot, whereas the former isn't. Individuals who choose to make a full knot usually do so to simply add a stronger and more solid join within the bar you are creating between the old stitch and the new stitch. If this was a sock, I would choose the half knot method instead of the full knot because full knots, especially on the wrong side, can create a hot spot on the foot, heel, or ankle. If you are making a tubular infinity scarf, a full knot would be appropriate. And actually, in this case, you also needn't worry about weaving in your ends, as there would not be any access to the wrong side of the scarf as it ends up becoming an enclosed tube. And in fact, this is the exact method I use for all of my infinity scarves I've made over the years. If you are making a sweater or a cardigan and used this particular join method, you would have to weave in all of your ends, which is the only real con to using this type of join. So those are 4 different techniques for joining new yarn when you've come to the end of your current while knitting within your work. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you did, please give it a like, and I also welcome any and all comments. Please subscribe to my channel for other useful techniques, tips, and tricks. Thank you again for watching, and as always, happy knitting!